The year is 445 BCE. Stand at the edge of what was once the greatest city in the ancient Near East. The wind moves through broken archways and toppled columns. Jackals pick through rubble where merchants once traded spices from Arabia and cedar from Lebanon. The gates, those magnificent cedar and bronze gates that once announced Jerusalem to the world, are charred stumps sinking into mud. The walls that Solomon's engineers built to endure centuries lie in heaps, some sections so thoroughly demolished that even the stones themselves have been quarried away and reused in the fortifications of enemy cities. Where 50,000 people once lived, traded, prayed, argued, and raised children, there are perhaps a few thousand survivors clinging to the ruins of what their grandparents remembered as glory. This is Jerusalem. Not fallen, shattered. Not conquered, erased. And somewhere, 1,000 kilometers to the east, in the jeweled corridors of the Persian palace of Susa, a man named Nehemiah sets down a cup of wine and begins to weep. What happens next defies every principle of ancient urban reconstruction. It challenges the logistics of military engineering. It overturns the political calculus of imperial administration. And for those who look closely enough at the numbers, the precise, documented, verifiable numbers, it raises a question that historians, archaeologists, and theologians have been arguing about for 25 centuries. Was this achievement the product of extraordinary human organization, or something that organizational theory simply cannot explain? 52 days. That is how long it took. To understand what 52 days means, you first have to understand what had been destroyed and how long it had been destroyed. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II completed what his armies had begun over a decade earlier. Jerusalem fell not once, but in stages. First a siege in 597 BCE that resulted in the deportation of King Jehoiachin and 10,000 of Jerusalem's elite, craftsmen, warriors, officials to Babylon. Then a second, definitive assault in 586 that left the city comprehensively dismantled. The Temple of Solomon, which had stood for nearly 4 centuries, was systematically looted and burned. Its gold menorah, its bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high, cast in the clay of the Jordan Valley, its altar of acacia wood, its 10 bronze basins on wheeled stands, all stripped, melted down, or carried back to Babylon as trophies to adorn the temple of Marduk. The Babylonian Chronicle and the Lachish letters, both archaeological documents, corroborate the biblical account's broad strokes. This was not the casual destruction of a raiding army. It was the deliberate erasure of a civilization's symbolic center. The walls were not merely breached, they were demolished. This distinction matters enormously to the story we are about to tell. A besieging army that breaks through walls leaves the infrastructure mostly intact. What Nebuchadnezzar ordered was categorically different. A systematic demolition designed to ensure that Jerusalem could never again function as a fortified city, never again serve as a rallying point for rebellion, never again project the kind of symbolic power that walled cities exercised in the ancient world. His engineers worked methodically, section by section, dismantling courses of stone, filling in the foundation trenches, removing the rubble so that rebuilding would require not just repair, but reconstruction from the ground up. This is what Nehemiah would eventually face. Not a wall that needed patching, a memory of a wall. For 141 years, Jerusalem sat in this condition. 4 generations of Jewish exiles in Babylon were born, lived, and died without ever seeing the city their prayers faced.
When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and issued his famous decree permitting the Jews to return to their homeland. A wave of exiles made the difficult journey back, but what they found was not a city waiting to be reoccupied. It was an archaeological site. The returning exiles, led first by Zerubbabel and later by Ezra the scribe, managed to reconstruct the temple itself, completed around 515 BCE after 20 years of fitful work. But the walls remained unbuilt, partially through poverty, partially through lack of organization, and significantly through active political opposition from neighboring peoples who had no interest in seeing Jerusalem restored to regional prominence. The city remained defenseless for another 70 years after the temple's completion. Open cities in the ancient Near East were not merely militarily vulnerable. They were socially impossible. Without walls, there was no taxation base, no control of trade, no protection for accumulated wealth. Merchants did not settle in open cities. Skilled craftsmen did not raise families in places that could be raided without warning. A city without walls in the 5th century BCE was not a city, it was a village. A large, symbolic, heartbreaking village built on the ruins of an empire. This is the Jerusalem that Nehemiah hears about from his brother Hanani in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes I, approximately 445 BCE. The report is specific and devastating. The survivors in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned. Nehemiah collapses in grief. Who is this man, and why does his collapse matter? The details we have about Nehemiah come primarily from his own memoir, one of the most personally candid documents to survive from the ancient Near East. Unlike the stylized royal inscriptions of Assyrian and Persian kings, which present every campaign as a triumph and every decision as divinely ratified,
Nehemiah writes with the texture of a man who knows he might fail. He records his fears. He records his prayers. He records the specific words his opponents use to mock him. This candor is unusual, and it makes the document historically extraordinary. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes I, not a trivial position. In Persian court culture, the cupbearer was one of the most intimately trusted members of the royal household. He tasted the king's wine before serving it, which meant he stood between the king and assassination by poison. This required not just loyalty, but proximity, the kind of access that most officials at any level of the vast Persian bureaucracy never achieved. Nehemiah ate with the king. He stood beside him. He watched his moods and learned his temperament. He was, by any measure, a man who had built a life of extraordinary privilege and security inside one of history's most powerful empires. The Persian court at Susa was among the most sophisticated administrative environments in the ancient world. Artaxerxes I ruled a domain that stretched from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, encompassing 20 to 30 satrapies, each governed by appointed officials who reported upward through layers of bureaucracy to the royal secretariat. Palace correspondence, tax records, military logistics, diplomatic communications. The machinery of empire moved through Susa in a daily flood of documents, written on clay and papyrus and leather in Aramaic, the empire's administrative lingua franca. Nehemiah would have been fluent in this world. He would have understood how requests moved through the system, where leverage existed, which arguments landed with the king, and which were heard and forgotten. He was not, in other words, a naive man with a pious wish. He was a highly trained imperial administrator who had spent years learning to translate emotion into policy, and he was about to throw all of it into uncertainty for the sake of a city he may never have visited. When the king notices Nehemiah's grief, in an empire where showing sadness in front of the monarch was technically a capital offense, and asks what is wrong, Nehemiah's response is calculated and precise. He does not launch into a theological argument about the covenant between God and Israel. He does not appeal to abstract justice. He frames his request in the practical language of loyalty and administration. His ancestral city is in ruins, which reflects poorly on him, and by extension on the king who employs him. Then he asks for something that should have been impossible. He asks to be sent to Judah, appointed as governor, given letters of safe conduct through every Persian province between Susa and Jerusalem, and granted timber from the royal forests to rebuild the gates, the walls, and his own residence. He asks, in other words, for the full resources of the Persian imperial administration to be directed toward restoring a city that other Persian administrators in the region had spent decades ensuring would never be restored. The king says yes. Historians have spent considerable energy trying to explain why. Some point to the political value of a loyal, competent governor in a strategically sensitive province bordering Egypt, where Persia faced recurring instability. Others note that Artaxerxes had personal reasons to be responsive to Jewish petitions. His queen, Esther, was Jewish according to the biblical account, though this correlation is disputed. Still others suggest that Nehemiah's skill as a courtier, his ability to read Artaxerxes and frame the request in terms of Persian interests rather than Jewish sentiment, is the most parsimonious explanation. What is undisputed is the outcome. Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem with imperial authority, royal timber,
and a personal mission that has been 12 years in the planning from the moment he first heard the news from Hanani. He arrives quietly. This detail is not incidental. Nehemiah's memoir describes how he came to Jerusalem and spent 3 nights there before telling anyone, not the priests, not the nobles, not the officials, what he intended to do. Then, in the middle of the night, he rose with a small group of men and rode out to inspect the walls by moonlight, working his way around the perimeter of the city, examining each section, assessing what remained and what had been obliterated. The nocturnal inspection route described in Nehemiah's memoir has been traced by archaeologists with reasonable confidence. He exits through the Valley Gate on the western side of the city, moves south past the Dragon Spring, then east toward the Dung Gate at the city's southern tip. From there he follows what would have been the Eastern Wall, the section most thoroughly destroyed, where the terrain drops sharply into the Kidron Valley and the rubble slides down the hillside in layers. The Valley of Hinnom, the Fountain Gate, the King's Pool. Here the passage is so obstructed that his mount cannot find footing. He dismounts. He proceeds on foot through the darkness, picking his way over stones that were once a wall. What is he measuring? Not just structural damage. He is measuring possibility. He is calculating, in the dark, whether the task he has committed himself to before the king of Persia is actually achievable before someone, somewhere in the imperial network, changes their mind. What he finds is worse than reports suggested. At several points, the destruction is so complete that his riding animal cannot pass through the debris. He has to dismount and pick his way through rubble on foot. This nocturnal reconnaissance is militarily and administratively sensible. Any announcement of intention to rebuild would immediately alert the regional power brokers. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, Geshem, the Arab leader, who had every political and economic incentive to prevent a restored Jerusalem from altering the balance of power in the region. By conducting his inspection privately, Nehemiah gathers intelligence before his opponents can organize resistance. When he finally reveals his plan to the community leaders, he does not present it as his own initiative. He presents it as something God has already put in motion. The royal commission is evidence. The timber in the storehouses is evidence. The safe conduct letters are evidence. He is not asking Jerusalem to take a risk on an untested idea. He is inviting them to participate in something that has already begun.
The response is immediate. Let us rise up and build. What follows is a logistical operation that continues to astonish scholars of ancient construction 2.5 millennia later. Nehemiah's memoir includes one of the most detailed project management documents to survive from the ancient world. A precise accounting of who built which section of wall, what their professional backgrounds were, where they came from, and which gates they were responsible for. This list, preserved in the 3rd chapter of the book of Nehemiah, reads less like scripture and more like a modern construction Gantt chart rendered in genealogical language. The builders include priests and Levites, merchants and goldsmiths, perfume makers and district rulers, men from towns as far as Jericho and Tekoa, daughters of administrators working alongside their fathers. The work is organized by residential district. Families build the section of wall nearest their own homes, which is both logistically elegant and psychologically shrewd. A man defending his own door has a different relationship to the work than a laborer assigned to an anonymous section of perimeter.
The wall is not being built from scratch. Nehemiah's engineers are working with the existing foundation lines, using stones from the original structure where they can be recovered, filling gaps with the new material, raising courses on top of whatever courses remain. This reduces the scope significantly. This is reconstruction, not construction. But it still requires the mobilization of an entire urban population across a perimeter that archaeologists estimate at approximately 4 kilometers, incorporating at least 10 major gates and an unknown number of towers. The opposition begins almost immediately. But before it does, consider what is actually being asked of these people. The men and women who respond to Nehemiah's call are not professional soldiers or imperial construction crews. They are the remnant, the descendants of those who did not make the journey back to Babylon, or who returned from exile to find a landscape transformed by a century and a half of abandonment. They are farmers and priests, craftsmen and merchants, people whose daily lives are already organized around the business of survival in a province that the Persian administration treats as a minor backwater. Judah in 445 BCE produces no significant tribute revenue, no strategic military resource, no trade commodity that makes it essential to the imperial accounting. It exists at the margins of an empire that stretches from the Aegean to the Indus. These are the people who, when Nehemiah says, "Let us rise up and build," do exactly that. The goldsmiths repair their section. The perfume makers repair theirs. A man named Shallum, ruler of half the district of Jerusalem, works alongside his daughters, a detail so unusual for ancient construction records that scholars have noted it as evidence of genuine documentary authenticity rather than idealized historiography. No ancient scribe inventing a heroic national narrative would think to include the perfume makers.
Nehemiah's project management system is, by modern analysis, a form of what organizational theorists call distributed leadership with geographic accountability. Each team owns its section completely, from foundation to parapet, from gate hinge to lock bar. There is no central quality control supervisor moving from team to team. The accountability structure is built into the assignment system itself. If a section collapses, the neighborhood that built it is exposed. The incentive for quality is identical to the incentive for speed. They are sleeping inside what they are building. Sanballat's mockery is the first weapon. He gathers his officials and the Samaritan army and performs what amounts to a public ridicule campaign. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah joins in with precision designed to wound. Whatever they are building, if even a fox climbs up on it, he will break down their wall of stones. This is not mere insult. In the ancient Near East, public mockery of a construction project was understood to carry genuine power, to demoralize workers, to signal to other regional actors that the project lacked credibility, and to create conditions in which the builders themselves might begin to doubt. Nehemiah's memoir records the psychological toll with unusual honesty. "The strength of the laborers is giving out," he writes, "and there is too much rubble. We are unable to rebuild the wall." Then the mockery escalates to conspiracy. Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites form a coalition, planning to fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble. The threat is credible. These are governing officials with military assets, not merely hostile neighbors. Nehemiah responds on two tracks simultaneously. On the military track, he arms the builders.
Half his workforce continues construction, while the other half stands guard with spears, shields, bows, and armor. Those who carry materials work with one hand and hold a weapon in the other. The laborers who work the most exposed sections, rebuilding the gaps in the wall where there is no existing structure to provide cover, have swords belted at their sides while they work. A trumpeter stands beside Nehemiah at all times, ready to sound the alarm that will concentrate the workforce at any breach point. On the psychological track, he delivers what may be the most efficient motivational speech in the ancient record. "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." The threat never materializes into attack. Scholars debate why. The most common explanation is deterrence. The visible militarization of the workforce made the cost of assault prohibitive for a coalition operating without Persian authorization. Nehemiah had imperial letters. Attacking a Persian-appointed governor's construction project would have been an act of rebellion against Artaxerxes himself, and none of the regional players were prepared for that escalation. But the external threats are not Nehemiah's only problem. Inside the community, a social crisis is developing that threatens the project as seriously as any military coalition. The poor of Jerusalem are being crushed. Nehemiah's memoir pivots suddenly from construction logistics to a scene of devastating social conflict. Workers who have left their fields and farms to participate in the rebuilding are returning to find their daughters being sold into debt slavery, their fields mortgaged to wealthy neighbors, their grain supplies exhausted. The nobles and officials of Jerusalem are charging interest on emergency loans to their own people during a famine, Accumulating land and labor at the expense of those whose poverty the rebuilding project has only deepened. Nehemiah's response is not pastoral, it is administrative and furious. He calls a great assembly. He confronts the nobles and officials publicly, cataloging the specific economic mechanisms by which they are extracting wealth from the poor. He points out the absurdity of redeeming Jewish slaves from foreign masters on one hand, while creating Jewish slaves through debt bondage on the other. And then he demands, not requests, that they return the fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses they have taken, along with the interest they have charged. The confrontation ends with the wealthy officials and nobles saying nothing. They cannot argue with the specifics. They agree to return everything. Nehemiah records shaking out the folds of his robe and pronouncing a formal curse on anyone who fails to keep this pledge. A performative act that functioned in ancient Near Eastern cultures as something between a legal contract and a public oath. The assembly responds, "Amen. Praise the Lord." This episode is not a digression from the wall-building story. It is the story's hidden structural element. The workforce cannot rebuild if it is being economically dismantled from within. Social cohesion
is not a soft consideration in project management. It is load-bearing. Nehemiah understands this with the clarity of someone who has spent years watching how the Persian imperial court functions, where the interests of administrators and the interests of the administered are perpetually in tension. He also leads by example in a manner sufficiently unusual that he specifically documents it. As governor, he was entitled to a daily food allowance drawn from taxes on the population, the standard Persian administrative practice. He refuses to collect it. For 12 years of governance,
He and his household feed themselves at their own expense rather than extracting revenue from a community already under extraordinary strain. The wall continues to rise. The final assault on the project is the most sophisticated and the most personal. When the wall is nearly complete, only the gates still unfinished, Sanballat and Geshem send Nehemiah a letter. "Let us meet together," they write, "at one of the villages in the plain of Ono. Come, let us meet together." Nehemiah's memoir records his response with economy. "They intended to do me harm." He sends back 4 words. "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down." The invitation is repeated 4 times. 4 times, Nehemiah sends the same answer. On the 5th attempt, the letter arrives unsealed, deliberately unsealed, a violation of diplomatic convention that signals the message is intended to be read by couriers and officials along the route. Its contents: "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem confirms it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel, that you are building the wall for that reason, and that you intend to become their king. The king will hear this report. So come now, let us counsel together." This is geopolitical blackmail, an accusation of rebellion against Artaxerxes, whispered to the right people along the Persian administrative network, could end Nehemiah's appointment, his freedom, and possibly his life. He answers, "Nothing of what you say is true. You are inventing it out of your own mind." Then comes the attempt from within. A man named Shemaiah, a priest, an insider, invites Nehemiah to the temple for a private meeting. The message he delivers has the cadence of prophecy. "Let us meet in the house of God, within the temple, and let us close the doors, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming at night to kill you." Nehemiah's response reveals the depth of his political intelligence. He does not dismiss the warning, he analyzes it. God had not sent this man, he concludes. The prophecy was purchased. Someone, he names Tobiah and Sanballat, had hired Shemaiah to deliver a message designed to make Nehemiah flee into the temple sanctuary, which would both compromise his religious authority as a layman violating temple precincts and make him appear cowardly, undermining his leadership at the critical final stage of construction. He refuses to go. On the 52nd day after the building began, the 25th day of the month of Elul in the Jewish calendar, which places the completion somewhere in September of 445 BCE, the wall is finished. What does a finished wall mean in the ancient world? It means that Jerusalem has rejoined the community of cities. It means that merchants can now store goods inside the gates without fear of overnight raids. It means that families who have been sleeping with weapons beside their beds can, for the first time in living memory, trust that the stone between them and the wilderness will hold. It means that the Persian province of Yehud, which has for decades been a strategic liability, has acquired something that empires value, a defensible administrative center. But it means something else too, something that cannot be measured in meters of wall or tons of stone. It means that the people who built it had looked at 141 years of ruin and decided that the arithmetic of impossibility was not, in the end, binding. Nehemiah's memoir records what happened when the enemies of Jerusalem heard. all the surrounding nations were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. The mathematics, examined now with the clarity of distance, remains astonishing. Nehemiah's wall followed the line of the earlier Israelite fortifications, incorporating surviving foundation courses and towers from the pre-exilic period. Archaeological surveys, particularly the work conducted by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1960s and subsequent excavations in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, have helped establish approximate dimensions. Roughly 4 kilometers of perimeter, with walls estimated at some points to have reached 8 to 10 meters in height and 3 to 4 meters in thickness, incorporating at least 10 named gates and multiple towers. By modern construction estimations, a project of this scope with ancient technology, no mechanized equipment, no reinforced concrete, no modern surveying instruments, would typically require years. The rebuilding of ancient city walls in comparable contexts from Mesopotamia and Egypt, documented in royal annals, took anywhere from 3 to 12 years with full royal military labor forces. Nehemiah used civilians, merchants, goldsmiths, priests, women working alongside their fathers, people with no professional construction background, organized by neighborhood, building the section nearest their own homes, working under active threat of military attack, managing simultaneously a debt crisis that threatened to dissolve their workforce from within. 52 days. Consider what that number contains. In 52 days, the Roman legions, at their most efficient, could march from Rome to the Alps and back, twice. In 52 days, a standard Egyptian pyramid construction crew, working at pace, might lay 3 or 4 courses of interior stone. In 52 days, a medieval cathedral project would barely have completed its foundation surveys. The organizational achievement alone, coordinating thousands of workers across multiple simultaneous construction zones, maintaining security operations in parallel, adjudicating social conflicts that threatened project cohesion, deflecting political interference from multiple regional actors, refusing psychological manipulation from within and without, represents a level of project management sophistication that would not be systematically theorized until the 20th century. Some scholars explain the timeline through scope reduction. Nehemiah's wall, they argue, may have enclosed a smaller area than the pre-exilic city, representing emergency fortification rather than full restoration. The surviving archaeological evidence supports this in some areas and complicates it in others. The debate continues. Others explain it through the particular conditions of the moment: a motivated workforce defending their own homes and families, the concentration of collective trauma into collective action, the psychological force of a project that was simultaneously practical and profound. Social scientists who study reconstruction after catastrophe recognize the phenomenon. Communities that have survived destruction sometimes achieve impossible things in the immediate aftermath precisely because the alternative is unthinkable. And then there are those who look at the 52 days and the available variables and find that the arithmetic, no matter how carefully you approach it, produces a remainder that organizational theory cannot fully absorb. Jerusalem, rebuilt, would face centuries more of conquest and destruction. Alexander the Great would pass through in 332 BCE. The Maccabean revolt would fracture it in the 2nd century BCE. Rome would besiege it in 63 BCE and again in 70 CE, when Titus's legions would burn the Second Temple and scatter the population to the 4 corners of the empire. The walls Nehemiah built would be rebuilt and torn down and rebuilt again by Roman engineers, Byzantine architects, Crusader kings, Mamluk sultans, and Ottoman governors.
And yet, every one of those later builders was building on something. On a line in the earth, on a tradition of fortification,
On the physical and symbolic proof that a people who had been reduced to rubble could, in 52 days, transform grief into stone.
There is something in the human calculus that Nehemiah understood, something that governors and project managers and community leaders have been relearning in every generation since. That the difference between a city and a ruin is not time. It is not resources, not favorable politics, not the absence of enemies. It is the moment when enough people decide simultaneously that the alternative to rebuilding is simply not acceptable. 52 days is not a number. It is a decision. In every age, in every city that has been broken by history, that decision waits to be made again. The rubble is still there. The opposition is still organized. The nights are still long. But somewhere, in some corridor of power, in some private room where grief and responsibility sit together, someone is setting down a cup of wine and beginning to weep. And the 52 days have not yet started. This documentary is based on historical and archaeological research. The primary ancient source is the Book of Nehemiah, considered one of the most historically detailed personal memoirs to survive from the ancient Near East. Archaeological references draw on excavations conducted in Jerusalem's Jewish quarter and the work of Kathleen Kenyon at the Ophel. Historical context for the Persian court and the administration of the province of Yehud draws on the scholarship of Lester Grabbe, Joseph Blenkinsop, and the Cambridge History of Judaism. Images and visual reconstructions in this documentary were created using artificial intelligence to dramatize and illustrate historical events and environments for which no photographic record exists.